I originally agreed with sending our troops into Afghanistan to capture bin Laden and other members of al-Qaeda. But President Bush, in his role as commander-in-chief, indecisively dawdled around, and most of the al-Qaeda leadership escaped to Pakistan. Bush quickly lost interest in Afghanistan, and 6 months later he found a new interest, and that was planning the invasion of Iraq. Not believing the Bush administration claims that Iraq was an imminent threat to our country, I wrote to my representatives and senators and encouraged them to vote against the invasion of Iraq. This was in late summer, early fall of 2002. In December 2002, my Army Reserve Unit began preparing for war. In January of 2003, we were on active duty, and we would become part of the invasion force. Though I disagreed with the war, I felt an obligation and responsibility as an NCO to be with my soldiers, and I went to Iraq. The war in Iraq never went well from the start. We rushed into a country that we didn't understand the culture and the history of, and we made one mistake after another, such as disbanding the Iraqi military, firing all Ba'ath Party members from the government jobs, and we had the inability to control the country due to an insufficient number of troops. And while I was driving through the streets of Baghdad in a Humvee, we saw a Stars and Stripes newspaper that showed that President Bush had arrogantly declared victory in Iraq. And I've said this many times before, you could look out your window and tell that the war had not been won yet. My reserve unit returned home in the fall of 2003, even as the military situation in Iraq worsened. And I soon lost confidence in our military leadership. Though the generals were great at leading evangelical prayer meetings in the Pentagon, they proved themselves ineffective in fighting two wars. Equally important from my point of view, the Pentagon, starting with Donald Rumsfeld, seemed to care little about those who served under their leadership. They provided inadequate equipment to those serving on the battlefield, and they gave inadequate care for returning wounded veterans, such as housing wounded veterans in decrepit military facilities or giving inadequate treatment for veterans with PTSD. Just as bad, the Pentagon blatantly lied to us about what was happening on the battlefields. They lied about the capture of POW Jessica Lynch. They lied about the death of Army Ranger Pat Tillman. They lied about Abu Ghraib. We can accept that military operations often don't go as planned on the battlefield during war. But what we shouldn't accept is being lied to. Just give us the truth and we'll accept that. After retiring from the military at the end of 2005, I felt free to speak out against the war and for the rights of all returning veterans. I also started thinking about peace and the militaristic attitudes that we have here in America, things that I previously hadn't given much thought to. I also started my journey in faith that I had abandoned in disillusionment 10 years earlier. I was fortunate to find a church that shared my views on peace and social justice, and which treated all people with equality. My faith drives me to speak out, drives me to share my thoughts on peace, and to seek that which furthers peace. Before these two wars, I thought or cared little about how much we spent on the military. For 25 years, I was a participant and an observer in the expensive buildup of an all-volunteer military that became the pride of politicians wearing flags on their lapels, Pentagon generals, evangelical ministers, VFW and American Legion commanders alike. I watched generals being given every piece of sophisticated weaponry they could dream up. The purse was never shut when the Pentagon brass came to the Congress with their hands out. And the Pentagon doors were always open when salesmen from Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and others came knocking to peddle the latest instrument of death. We now spend more on our military than the rest of the world combined, and 9 times more than the next country on the list. The opportunity costs of that military spending have been enormous. Consider the good we could have done if we had spent all that money in this country and in the world on peaceful purposes. President Eisenhower said it better than I can. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. From my spiritual point of view, what we need here is a modern-day Jeremiah to stand before Congress and yell, "Hear this, you foolish and senseless people, who have eyes but do not see. Stop the insanity of our military spending." Somehow, some way, our politicians need to wake up and realize that militarization is not a path to peace. I'd like to share the short poem Choose by Carl Sandburg. The single clenched fist, lifted and ready, or the open hand, held out and waiting. Choose, for we meet by one or the other. For too many years, our country has had a foreign policy of the clenched fist of militarism, lifted and ready. It's time to choose the open hand of peace, held out and waiting to all the people of the world. And what's one of the biggest things, church tells our children? I mean, other to follow Christ and live a Christ-like life. And that one of those big things is thou shalt not kill. And so for 18, 19 years while they're living with you, they go to church with you, and they're taught, thou shalt not kill. Now all of a sudden, they go to basic training and go to advanced infantry training or whatever, and they're specifically told that they need to kill. What's the spirit of bayonet? To kill, to kill, to kill. What makes the green grass grow? Blood, blood, blood. And they're taught that kind of stuff, and it's in direct contradiction to what you've taught them for 18, 19 years of their life. So think about what's going through those new recruits' minds when they're being taught two conflicting things. And I sat down with a couple of the son that came back from Iraq, and they were telling me the same things, how they taught their kid, these same spiritual values. And then he goes off to war, and the Marine Corps teaches them exactly the opposite thing. And so the reason this couple comes to mind specifically is because he was talking to his parents one day. He came back and he had an extreme drinking and drug problem, just to deal with the PTSD. And he was telling about how when he tried to sleep, he couldn't get those bumps out of his mind, and that was, of course, his vehicle driving over a human being. So think of what kind of a spiritual conflict that young man went through. Talking with that family, the husband and father, he was just like me, an extreme amount of love for his children. And one night his son came up to him and he said, "Dad, hold me." So he sat on his dad's lap. This is like a 22, 20-year-old kid, and he sat on his dad's lap and he held him. And I would, of course, do the same thing with my son, even if they're 37 now. But the next morning, the father came home from work and he found his son hanging in the garage. It's hard for me to be in a church here and not swear about this type of stuff, but unfortunately, this conflict goes on with a lot of people, and that's a big part of PTSD. And if you go out to Fort Snelling National Cemetery right now, there clearly are just as many suicides of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans as there are of those killed in service to their country. Yet they don't get... Well, I'll just leave it at that. But